Hi there, I'm Nandini here with two cards for you using a fun technique. I have always been fascinated by the magic slider cards. It is so much fun to watch the image fill with color when you pull the slider away. I decided to use the tulip cluster from the Just a Note stamp set for my cards today. I love the stamp set because it looks equally good as an outline and when colored in. I had lots of fun creating these cards for you, and now my head is bursting with all the ways which I can use this technique. So let's get started. Let's start with the supplies for our magic slider cards. I will be using the lovely Just a Note stamp set today. I also have the decorative circles die set with its 3 sets of nested dies. For my card bases, I have the vertical A2 folding notelets. I also have a bunch of papers that I watercolored using the liquid watercolors. Whenever I work with watercolors, I try and make a few extra backgrounds. They come in really handy, especially for die cutting. You can check out some of my older videos for detailed steps that I use to create these. For the first magic slider card, we will need one of our colored backgrounds. But before we get to that, we need to do our stamping. I have a piece of white cardstock measuring 3 3/4 by 5 inches. This is just a guide, and I have a piece of OHP sheet on which I will do the actual stamping. The OHP sheet and the white cardstock piece measure the same. I'm first placing the large cluster of tulips into my stamp positioner. Next, I will take a sentiment from the birthday girl stamp set and place it on the paper. I want the sentiment to be in 2 parts so that it is revealed as we slide the slider out. The second sentiment is from the birthday boy stamp set. I think these 2 sentiments work really well together. I'm closing the lid of the positioner so that the stamps stick to the lid. I'm placing the OHP sheet on top of the cardstock piece. Since I plan to do heat embossing, I'm prepping my OHP sheet with lots of talcum powder to ensure that it is static free. This is an important step as embossing powder tends to stick everywhere. I always have a small container of talcum powder and an old makeup brush on hand whenever I do heat embossing. I'm using the Versamark ink for stamping. Remember that plastic has a very slick surface and tends to slide easily. I prefer to apply generous amounts of Versamark ink to my stamp and get my stamping perfect the first time round. I'm pouring a generous amount of superfine black embossing powder over the Versamark ink. I like to repeat this a couple of times so that I get a nice thick layer of embossing powder on the surface. The excess embossing powder just falls away if you tap the panel a few times. If there are any stray bits of powder still clinging, just use a small dry brush to remove them. I took my panel off the screen and heat embossed it. One rule to follow when heat embossing on plastic is to make your heat gun really hot and keep it moving. Otherwise, your plastic will soften and become distorted. Once the plastic is cool, I will just buff the panel with a dry towel to remove the talcum powder residue. And with that, our first layer is ready to go. For the colorful background, I need a panel which is the same size as my OHP panel. I'm simply placing the OHP panel over the watercolored panel and cutting out a piece. The next step is to stamp the second part of the sentiment onto the background. I'm using the OHB panel as my guide for the correct placement. I'm stamping the sentiment with black ink so that it shows up against the intense background. I'm repeating the stamping again to ensure that I get a nice crisp image. I felt that my background looked a little plain, so I'm filling it up by stamping more tulip clusters. I want a subtle look, and the Firebreak Distress Oxide ink is perfect for this. Just remember to heat set the ink before you handle the panel. Distress Oxide inks tend to take longer to dry and they can smear easily. Let's move on to the assembly of our card. I will start by die cutting a rectangle out of the front of an A2 top folding card base. The colored background goes behind the window and the stamped OHB sheet is layered above. I'm using liquid glue to stick both my layers. This is the basic mechanism of any magic slider card. Once the glue is dry, it is time to create the space for the slider. I'm adding thin strips of foam tape on three sides of the card. The foam tape I'm using is not too thick as I don't want too much bulk. If you don't have a suitably thick foam tape, you can always stack 3-4 strips of cardstock together and use that as a spacer. To create a slider that fits perfectly, I will mark the spaces on a piece of cardstock with a pencil and then cut it out. I'm making sure that my slider fits perfectly between the spacers and slides in and out comfortably. I made the slider a bit longer than my card as I want to have some space to hold it and pull it out easily once the card is assembled. I'm adding a bit more interest to my slider by inking the panel with the diagonal plaid stencil and 3 shades of Distress Oxide inks. Since the slider is longer than my stencil, I get a white band at the top. The diagonal plaid stencil is easily expandable and I will use this quality to expand my stenciling seamlessly. It is very easy to realign the stencil and add more ink to the top of the panel. I'm also going back with my blending brushes to add a wash of color to the panel as I want to soften the stark white lines across. I'm also gluing another piece of cardstock behind the ink panel as I want my slider to be sturdy. To complete the mechanism, I'm removing the release paper from the foam tapes. I like to align the top first and then gradually move down. With that, our slider mechanism is complete and the card is almost ready. As a final touch, I will stamp the word pull at the top of the slider. I will round the top corners of the slider and then mount the entire mechanism on a top folding card base. The second card I am making today is very similar to the first since the basic slider mechanism is the same. The difference is in how I treat the background. I'm going to start by stamping the tulip cluster on a piece of OHP sheet measuring roughly 3 inches by 3 inches and then onto a piece of white cardstock. The stamping on both needs to be identical as the layers need to align exactly in the final card. I have used Versamark ink for the stamping and metallic gold embossing powder for the heat embossing. The next step is to color the tulips. I'm using watercolor brush pens to do this. You can use any medium like watercolors, alcohol markers, inks, etc. to do it. I'm not an expert at coloring, so I love using the brush markers as they blend very easily and also have bright colors. I'm putting some orange color at the base of the petals and the shadowed areas. I will use the yellow pen to pull the orange towards the top. For the background, I'm using the blue pen and blending it out with water. I will allow the panel to air dry once I'm done. I have an A2 top folding card base and a piece of cardstock cut to 5 by 3 inches with me. I'm using the middle circles from the decorative circles die, and I will cut a window in the cardstock panel using the plain circle die. I'm placing the colored panel under the window, and once I'm happy with the placement, sticking it down to the card base with some liquid glue. Now I will align the stamped OHP panel with the colored tulips and glue it to the window panel. If there is any bit showing through, we can just trim it off after the glue is dry. I have cut a frame out of teal cardstock with the decorative circle die, and I'm gluing this frame around the window. I'm aligning the stamping on the OHP sheet with the background and tracing the outline of the panel on the base. This way I know the exact placement of the window panel. I'm cutting strips of foam tape and placing them inside the pencil outlines such that they will not show once the window panel is in place. Once the foam tapes are in place, I will create the slider. I rounded the corners of the window panel and also stamped the sentiment from the birthday boy stamp set with orange ink to match the colored tulips. I'm erasing the pencil lines and then peeling the release paper off the foam tape. I will carefully align the two images before pressing down the window panel onto the card base. The slider fits perfectly inside the card. I'm drawing a pencil line so that I know where to stamp the word pull. As a final touch, I rounded the top corners of the slider. And with that, a second card is also ready. I hope you enjoyed these two versions of Magic Slider cards. I do hope you will give these techniques a try. Have you tried to create slider cards? Are there any other interactive card techniques you want me to cover? Please do let me know in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified when new videos are uploaded. Goodbye and take care.